Welcome, MJMC students. Let's just dive right into this explainer, shall we? Today, we're going to demystify some of those incredibly abstract communication frameworks that you absolutely need to master, not just to ace your exams, but for your future media careers. You know, communication is this wild, intricate, dynamic process, and today we are figuring out exactly how to map it all out together.
So, here's our game plan for today's taxonomy. We'll be looking at the purpose of models, comparing linear and nonlinear models, exploring symbolic and physical models, and finally, weighing their advantages and limitations.
All right, let's get into it.
Starting right off with the purpose of models and how we actually navigate human complexity. Because let's be real, to truly understand communication, we first have to admit that human interaction is just incredibly complex. It's ever-evolving, and honestly, sometimes it's completely ambiguous. We often don't even know our own objectives, let alone the actual impact our messages are going to have.
So, what's a model in this context? Well, it's essentially a map that imposes a bit of order onto all that chaos. It's an abstract representation of real-world phenomena, used to simplify complex subjects, observable phenomena, or procedures, so we can actually focus in and examine them. It takes a messy, dynamic, interactive process and captures it in a simplified static format, highlighting the critical stuff that would otherwise just get lost in the noise. This helps us analyze these processes effectively and even gives us a fascinating peek into the viewpoint of the designer.
And this actually brings us to a foundational idea. Aristotle was literally a pioneer in identifying the challenges of persuasion, giving us ethos, logos, and pathos. And what's wild is that, despite decades of incredibly rapid changes in media technology, these foundational elements are exactly what our modern models are still trying to map out today.
Moving on to linear versus nonlinear models, the big divide. Let's see how the actual structure of a model completely dictates how we understand the flow of a message.
This dichotomy is fantastic because it perfectly illustrates the stark contrast between older, action-oriented media systems and modern, interactive communication. On one hand, you've got linear models representing this unidirectional, one-way flow from the speaker directly to the audience. But on the other hand, nonlinear models are all about bidirectional or multidirectional flow, featuring these continuous feedback loops.
Now, if you dig into older media studies, you're going to see linear models absolutely everywhere. They are super sender-oriented. Historically, they were mainly used for experimental purposes to figure out exactly how a sender should formulate and structure a message to achieve a very specific persuasive effect. Think propaganda or mass persuasion. But the catch? If the sender doesn't structure that message perfectly, or if the audience decides to apply their own meanings, bam, miscommunication happens. Conversely, nonlinear models rely heavily on the principles of cybernetics. Specifically, they draw on the concept of circuits theorized by Carl Deutsch back in 1968. Deutsch suggested that we share information through networks and circuits, literally a circular loop that facilitates a two-way exchange. So this generates feedback, right? Which then prompts new actions, which generates even more feedback. It's this continuous self-generating loop. Okay, having established the flow of communication, let's drill down a bit deeper into our taxonomy and explore symbolic models, words and math.
Symbolic models basically break down into two main types. You have verbal models, which use language to articulate theories in words, and then you have mathematical models, which quantify information using things like statistical concepts and graph theory.
As future media professionals, you are going to use verbal models all the time. I'm sure we've all heard of Gerbner's model or Lasswell's model. But hey, here's a totally surprising fact for you. David Berlow's famous SMCR model, source, message, channel, receiver? Well, Berlow actually admitted in 1977 that he originally didn't even intend for it to be a communication model in the first place. He just designed it as a handy audiovisual aid to help people remember communication concepts. Talk about a model taking on a life of its own, right?
Then on the flip side, we have mathematical models. Now, while we might not bump into these quite as often in general humanistic communication fields, models like Shannon Weaver's information theory are absolutely crucial. When we need to get into the weeds and analyze complex communication networks, information processing, signal transmission, or noise, we absolutely need the statistical concepts these models provide.
Next up, we are pivoting from the symbolic over to the structural as we explore physical models and concrete structures. Physical models are categorized into two camps: iconic models, which act as visual representations of what they stand for, and analog models, which function based on underlying structural relationships.
Iconic models are, well, exactly what they sound like. They're straightforward, pictorial visual representations of persons, objects, or scenes. We're talking photographs, sculptures, paintings. If you're heading into advertising or visual storytelling, you're going to be relying heavily on iconic models to transmit your messages.
But what's really fascinating here are the analog models. These models bear a defined structural relationship to their subject, but they don't actually look anything alike visually. Think about how a computer is so often used as an analog for the human brain, or how an electrical circuit is used to clarify complex human interactions. It's essentially using something highly familiar to explain something profoundly complex.
So we've built an incredible taxonomy of models today, right? From linear to nonlinear, symbolic to physical. But before we take these frameworks out into the real world, there is a highly critical question we have to ask ourselves. Is the map actually the territory?
Let's dig into that by looking at the advantages and limitations and critically evaluating the maps we use.
Look, models provide massive advantages. Just as the researcher Chapanis noted back in 1961, they distill immense complexity into simpler, comprehensible terms. They don't just ignore the complexity, they impose order to organize coherent elements. They facilitate inquiry by giving us a broad perspective to uncover totally new insights. They hold serious heuristic value by helping us formulate new hypotheses. And they literally allow us to predict and measure communication processes and outcomes. However, and this is a big however, reducing rich, unpredictable human behavior to neat, definable constructs risks severe and misleading oversimplifications. We could easily overlook critical, relevant elements just because the model accommodates too much imprecision. Plus, designers can suffer from what's known as premature closure. That happens when we rush to a conclusion and just assume our abstract model is perfectly complete, effectively trapping ourselves in our own abstraction.
Which brings us right to our final takeaway. The researcher Mortensen points out that when we investigate unfamiliar domains, we often mistake our models for reality itself. The map literally becomes a proxy for the actual event. So, as you graduate and go out there to create your own media campaigns, keep the general semanticist's warning in mind. The map is not the territory. Confusing your theoretical communication model for actual, messy human reality is a really dangerous trap. So, I'll leave you with this to chew on. As you build your future strategies, how will you ensure your maps remain true to the chaotic, beautiful territory of real human connection?